Peace, whale. Good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Len Pierre, and I am the consultant for Indigenous cultural safety and humility at Fraser Health Authority. I have created this welcome and orientation video to welcome all of our new colleagues to Fraser Health in a good way, to introduce myself and who I am, my role and responsibility within this health authority, but also to introduce and orientate you to the Indigenous Cultural Safety Initiative at Fraser Health Authority. So bear with me one second here as I bring up, I'm just going to share my screen. So to begin, I would just like to position myself in how I am showing up to this work and how I continue to commit myself to showing up to this work and working together as colleagues. So my ancestral name is Palikulak, and I am Coast Salish from Katzie First Nation. So I am very much local to the traditional territories in which we provide our work and services. And so my role within Indigenous cultural safety and humility as a consultant really is multifaceted. Some of it is in education and training, sometimes it's in policy review, program planning, or really I identify it as being available as a support person for all of our colleagues at Fraser Health to apply a cultural safety lens to our work. So if you're watching this today, that would probably include you and your roles and your responsibilities moving forward as well. I know that when we talk about cultural safety and cultural humility, sometimes it creates this feeling of that we are othering people. And that is not necessarily how I show up to this work. I really do show up with a spirit of kindness, a spirit of respect, and a spirit of relationship. So meaning that we will get to know one another and support each other and each other's good work moving forward. So what is cultural safety? Would be a really good starting point. Cultural safety is an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. It results in an environment free of racism and discrimination where people feel safe when receiving health care. I always like to say that cultural safety is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a practice. It's not perfection. In any regard, it's a beautiful case of imperfection. So for our journey, where does that journey begin? For many of us, it begins from a place of what I call cultural avoidance. And cultural avoidance might also look like coming from a place of cultural blindness. People, well-intentioned people that say things like, well, I don't see color, or I don't see culture. But, we do take into consideration people's culture, just like how we take into consideration people's ability and people's gender. These are things that we are programmed to as social human beings of the planet. So we do need to put culture on the table for discussion because culture is real. So let's be real and have those kinds of conversations. And when people are saying things to me like, Len, I don't see color or I don't see culture, what they're really telling me is that they're refusing to see my reality. So what we want to start doing is if we are using that language or using that approach, what we want to start to do is move away from that approach. Because quite often as Canadians, we pride ourselves in our multiculturalism and our kindness. But if we don't kind of like dig down deeper, we'll never get to that place of being more culturally aware of other people's cultures who we are providing care and services to in a healthcare setting. So we want to move away from cultural avoidance and come to a place of cultural awareness. And when I say cultural awareness, it's really not just, what culture a person comes from, what food they enjoy, what languages they speak. What I want to get to is what I encourage us all to get to is a place of deeper cultural awareness, meaning what is the culture? What are the cultural practices? What are the cultural approaches? And what are the cultural attitudes to different wellness or lifestyle decisions or practices that we come across in everyday life? So within a First Nations context, what are the cultural practices for Indigenous folks who are giving birth? What are their traditional birthing practices? What are their approaches to death and dying, or child raising, or marriage, or decision-making at the community level? Only when we're more culturally aware of other people's cultures can we actually implement our own sense of cultural sensitivity by knowing what we can and cannot say. What I will say about cultural sensitivity is that there is this misconception that cultural safety training is really about cultural sensitivity training. But that is not so, because cultural sensitivity are these like tiny little aspects of ourselves that we can adjust, which we definitely want to do, but there's more work to be done after we are sensitive about other people's cultures. Cultural safety is where we have more practical, pragmatic strategies that we can implement, embed, and advance in our in our professional practices. And then what I say is on the cherry on the top, where ideally as human beings and citizens of the planet, where we would all want to be, is coming from a place of cultural advocacy. And advocacy really is going above and beyond the call of duty for the Indigenous peoples that we mean to serve in the healthcare setting. So what is an example of cultural advocacy? That might look like when you're at a team meeting or in a conference room and you look around the room and you see no Indigenous people who are present at that meeting, nor is there a staff person with Indigenous in their title or department affiliation. They can use their position and their voice to advocate for Indigenous cultural safety and humility to be brought into that space for planning and work. So as part of your orientation, I did want to address some misconceptions there are about cultural safety. The first assumption is that your site or service has no Indigenous patients. That is I would use a word of caution in making any kind of assumption that there are no Indigenous patients accessing a specific service or a specific program within our healthcare system. Because as Indigenous people, we do come with different appearances. Sometimes we have blonde hair and blue eyes. Sometimes we may not appear what would be, and have an Indigenous look or belonging to an Indigenous culture. So it's not necessarily a culturally safe assumption to just assume that there are no Indigenous patients accessing your services. And I'll leave it at that. Number two, racism is an isolated event. Now, this is something that we come up quite frequently in cultural safety and humility training. And racism is not an isolated event. Racism is much more of a systemic experience rooted in the status quo. And so what I invite our colleagues to do is move away from looking at or interpreting racism as isolated events. They're in bad apples. It is part of a much broader, what I call Canadian socialization as an event. Number three, the term cultural competency is a term that we have since started to move away from in Fraser Health because it kind of has that small implication that you can take a course or take a training session and then therein be culturally competent in other people's cultures. Really, again, to honor and reflect that cultural safety training is a lifelong commitment to learning and unlearning, where I'm moving away and inviting our colleagues to move away from the term cultural competency. Number four, folks who say regardless of culture, and quite often that is used as an umbrella or a blanket approach to working with Indigenous people as belonging to many different cultural aspects. Cultural safety cannot exist within a multicultural approach. Therein it needs to have its own Indigenous specific cultural safety, Indigenous specific diversity and equity and inclusivity initiatives and strategies moving forward. And quite often for us, our experience as Indigenous people, the term regardless of culture has really not done a good service to us as Indigenous peoples in the past, nor would it set us up for success if we continue to use words like regardless of culture. Number five, another misconception that I have heard out there and come across in my own professional teaching practice is that people say, well, I have training for cultural safety and cultural humility, but colonialism and the harms of, historical traumas and race-based traumas and race-based violence, did not happen and occur overnight. So again, I just honor and reflect that this is a practice and not perfection. It's a journey, not a destination. And we should never, ever really be in our own professional domain and reflecting a message of, I have all the training that I need to be culturally safe. And that's why humility plays such a big part in cultural safety and cultural humility, is that we have to recognize that this learning is ongoing, that, you know, there are going to be sometimes where we make mistakes in our professional practice. And part of our calling as professionals is to apologize and exercise our cultural humility by not giving up on our learning and not giving up on our want and desire to be here to do good work. So same thing, number 6, saying for all cultures is very much the same as regardless of culture. And then the last point is decolonization and reconciliation are solely for Indigenous peoples. Decolonization and reconciliation are words that I invite each and every one of you to put into your vocabulary word bank and start to use within your own professional practice moving forward, because there is tremendous benefit and gain from the entirety of, you know, the sepia of humanity that can gain and benefit from all of us understanding the work of decolonizing and reconciliatory work, and even more so if we just roll up our sleeves and dive into that work in a good way. There are 2 avenues for cultural safety and humility, not avenues, I call them pillars, that really scaffold a good cultural safety and humility approach in the healthcare setting. The first pillar for cultural safety and humility is the attainment of knowledge and skills. So that looks like ongoing cultural safety training, humility, ongoing cultural safety and humility training, whether that's virtually, online, through PHSA, or through our own Fraser Health Aboriginal Health Training e-learning modules or in-person classroom sessions. It's also a commitment to anti-racism work, diversity, inclusivity, equity-oriented lenses, really coming at things through a justice doing and a human rights kind of lens. But it's also, you know, encompassing of trauma and resiliency informed practice, decolonizing the methods that we use in our professional practice, our commitment to lifelong learning, and then of course how we exercise our cultural advocacy and how we show up to be a good ally in this work. The second pillar for scaffolding cultural safety work is having access to culture. And having access to culture really is leaning into systemic transformation for how we do our business in the healthcare setting. And we have some work ahead of us. And our Aboriginal health team at Fraser Health has been working diligently to increase the amount of opportunities and avenues where Indigenous patients and clients and families can access these services. What do those services look like? Well, they look like, you know, the knowledge and wisdom and presence of elders in our institutional spaces, or cultural advisors who are not necessarily old enough or deemed to be elders yet by the community, but people who are keepers of their knowledge, keepers of their language, or keepers of their ceremony. They also look like having access to Aboriginal health liaisons, ceremony, whether it's a cedar brushing ceremony, a smudge ceremony, or a traditional healing ceremony, indigenized spaces, sacred spaces, gathering spaces, land recognition. So we're also inviting colleagues and sites and programs and services all across Fraser Health to really transform their physical spaces, because cultural safety is not just something we know, it's something that we can evoke into our physical spaces. So indigenizing those spaces by having a territory acknowledgement like a plaque or a mural on the wall can go a great distance in that regard. Having access to traditional medicines, and of course, Indigenous recruitment and retention. When we are doing the work of cultural safety and humility, we're actually contributing to and are part of a much bigger movement, a societal shift that is happening in this country that makes for really interesting and exciting times to be engaged in cultural safety work moving forward. In 2015, Fraser Health signed its declaration of commitment, along with all the other regional health authorities in this province, to advance and embed cultural safety and humility into practice, procedure, and policies for the next 5 years, which takes us up until 2020, where we are in the middle of renewing that commitment and creating a new strategic plan that will take us for the next 5 years. But again, we are not alone in this work in Fraser Health. We are joined by, systems and institutions and organizations, municipalities and post-secondary institutions, elementary schools and high schools, who are all picking up the fight to make a better world for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples alike. So when we're taking up the work of cultural safety and humility in our healthcare system, Fraser Health, what we're actually doing is we're actually contributing to and responding and reflecting big pieces of work like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry and calls for justice. We are reflecting the work that is required of us out of BC's adoption and inclusion of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that came into legislation 1 year ago in the fall of 2019 in British Columbia. We are also, honoring the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is also still very new. When we're exercising cultural safety and humility, we're also reflecting our trauma and resiliency informed practice because one of the principles reflected in TRIP is cultural safety. But it's also honoring the Partnership Change Accord, which is an agreement that we have as Fraser Health Authority with local Indigenous leaders to transform our system for the better. Now, staying informed and staying connected is really to honor and recognize that the lifelong commitment of working together. I would never ever suspect that you watch an orientation video or partake in an Indigenous cultural safety training course and then feel like, you are ready to go and pick up the work. I do recognize that this calls for relationship building. This calls for a degree of resources that you may or may not have access to. This does call for you feeling supported in this work. And so again, this is how I like to show up to this work, is making sure that each and every one of you feel supported in the important work that you have to do in your day-to-day operations. So out of the Cultural Safety Initiative at Fraser Health, we do have a Cultural Safety Pulse page that is geared solely to everything to do with Indigenous cultural safety and humility in professional practice. So for those of you who have access to the Cultural Safety Pulse page, I just go up to the search engine in the left, the top left corner here, and I type in cultural safety, and this will be the landing page that will come up next. On this landing page is how I stay connected to the thousands of colleagues that we have in Fraser Health, and I promote cultural safety training, education, and workshops, all with an Indigenous health focus and topic areas that are brought forward on different topics are brought forward at different times throughout the year. But I also provide things like resource booklets, resource guidelines, as well as cultural protocols to get to some of those, deeper level understandings of how some Indigenous cultures approach things in a different way. So with that, I would like to highlight one new growing resource that will intersect, in a time of COVID, where we are welcoming, a growing team of contact tracers. Many of you who are watching this video right now, our work will intersect in the work that you have ahead of you. And one of the resources I am working on is some guidelines for Indigenous self-identification and an online course, the Learning Hub, called the Indigenous Self-Identification for Registration. And really what that does is it highlights the who, what, where, when, why, how of why we ask race-related questions like, why would we ask a patient, do you self-identify as Indigenous/Aboriginal, yes or no? And that is a very important question that exists in healthcare today. And if we did not have access to the training of why we ask that question, and I've spoken to a lot of our colleagues in Fraser Health who say, well, Len, I don't ask that question. I don't ask that question because, number one, I feel like it's discriminatory, and then it also feels like I'm being excluding actual Indigenous patients. And so, upon further reflection with many of our community partners have worked and leaned into developing these resources that are going to be available. And what that looks like, because they're not ready to go yet, now that I've let the cat out of the bag, the Indigenous self-identification question that will be seen for registration clerks as well as contact tracers during this global pandemic is, The question comes in two parts. The first question is, as I've said, do you self-identify as Indigenous/Aboriginal? Yes, no, or prefer not to disclose? Don't ask me again. If the client asks yes, or clicks yes, or self-identifies as yes, belonging to Indigenous, it'll lead to a second follow-up question. And that follow-up question is really just to, really get a sense of how they are identifying as an Indigenous person. Do they self-identify as First Nations, or Métis, or Inuit, or other? There will be an other section there too, because Indigenous peoples don't just exist here in Canada. We exist all around the world, in Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, and Alaska. So we do leave room for people to self-disclose as Indigenous, but belonging to other cultures that might self-identify as Indigenous around the world. Why we ask that question is imperative. It is important because that data that we collect from the self-identification question will inform us as a system, as a whole system. Number one, how is disease and certain health disparities impacting the Indigenous communities that we aim to serve? So as Indigenous folks, we are overrepresented in health disparities, anywhere from mental health, substance use, and chronic diseases like kidney disease or heart conditions. But also in a time of a global pandemic, we have leadership and leadership commitments, where leaders are asking us, how is COVID-19 impacting the Indigenous communities that we aim to serve? And so we do need to, and in good partnership, need to have access to that data. So it is a very crucial question that we are asking folks to feel comfortable asking. And if you don't feel comfortable, you can always email me, and we can talk more about that and find ways of finding the comfort and the readiness to ask that question. The second question, or the second reason that it is that we ask that self-identifier question is, so that, we know who's accessing our services, where they're accessing them, and when they're accessing them, so that we can distribute our resources more evenly and with an equity-oriented type of lens. So we know exactly where folks are and how they're showing up to the sites and services that we offer in this large health authority and this large region that we serve. So last but not least, that was a very short introduction to Indigenous cultural safety and humility as an initiative at Fraser Health. Here is my contact information. This is my email, len.pierre@fraserhealth.ca. I say to all of the colleagues that I encounter on a day-to-day basis that my virtual door is always open. Do not hesitate to ask any kind of question, or if there are inquiries or concerns or ideas that you have about moving forward or getting involved with the Cultural Safety Initiative, or how you want to demonstrate your own commitment to this initiative, my virtual door is always open. And I am here to support, but I'm also here to serve as well. So with that, I raise my hands to each and every one of you, thanking you for taking the time to view this video, to roll up your sleeves and get involved in the work. And thank you for your work. Thank you for everything that you do when you show up to Fraser Health with a good heart and a good mind to serve the communities, all the communities that we serve, not just Indigenous communities at Fraser Health, but all the communities that we serve. So thank you very much for your time, for being here today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected.